My name is Liliana Faccioli Pintozzi. I am head of international news at Sky G24, and today I will be your moderator. So first of all, just let me introduce Mr. James Zhang, Director of UNCTAD Division on Investment Enterprise, to open this session. Mr. Zhang, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Liana. Distinguished panelists, participants, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this 7th World Investment Forum and to this exciting panel exploring the interface between the work and the priorities of the G20 presidency and investment. So I'm so happy to see the eminent panelists here. First of all, I would like to take this opportunity to thank our partner, the Italian Institute for International Political Studies, for co-organizing this session as the T20 National Coordinator and the Chair. The T20 Chair, chaired by ISPAI, has been the think tank and intellectual backbone of the G20, feeding into the policy discussions of G20 leaders. Allow me use my few minutes to take stock of the history of G20 in dealing with investment issues. I think that's part of the discussion. UNCTAD and myself started involved in G20 back in 2010. That was the very beginning when investment issue became an issue on the G20 agenda. Of course, in 2009, in the summit declaration, G20 members invited UNCTAD, OECD, WTO to do periodical report on trade and investment measures to refrain from protectionism in the wake of the financial crisis. And then we started our periodical report quarterly first, and then and then twice a year. Now, since 2010, there was the formal process for us to involve, and I personally involved, just to say, overall, for G20 working investment, there have been 2 phases and 2 tracks. The 2 phases, the first phase was basically the work of G20 on investment were in the framework of high-level development working group established in 2010 during the Korean presidency, leading up to the Seoul summit. And then the second phase was basically in 2016 that we started with established a working group on trade and investment and leading up to the trade and investment ministerial. So that started 2016. That's the 2 phases investment issues dealt with in G20. The second of the two tracks. The first track, of course, is trade investment track, as I said, first in high-level development group, particularly linked to development issues. And then the second track is called the Sherpa's track. The Sherpa track is more of our 3 organizations, OECD, WTO, UNCTAD, reporting periodically on global trade and investment trends, particularly policy developments, this quarterly and twice a year type of thing. So 2 phases, 2 tracks. What have been the major issues dealt with and which are the milestones? I would say that there are quite a few issues that we should be proud of saying that international organizations providing the backstopping to G20 in the area of investment. The first was at a very early stage during the Korean presidency initiated, and then to the climax of French presidency the year after. That was the principles for responsible investment in agriculture. In fact, that was started by our support with G7 or G8 at that time, and then as the guiding principles in light of the kind of a triple crisis: food, fuel, and finance, and the land grab. So we came up with the principles, drafting the principles for G7, and from the G7 it went to G20, and then discussed at Korean presidency, and then finalized at French presidency. And later on, we used that presented the principle to UN General Assembly, and we got a resolution on that. That's one landmark, invest in agriculture, sustainable development. The other one is the landmark is the G20 guiding principles for global investment policy making. That was in 2016 during the China presidency. And that was the first time the Trade and Investment Working Group and the Trade Investment Ministerial track was established. And through that process, there was guiding principles, 9 guiding principles adopted that with the drafting, initial drafting from UNCTAD colleagues, and we were involved, and I was the facilitator for negotiations, and then we got it through. That was a landmark on investment in G20. Still, if you see the outcome document of G20 afterwards, including the summit, you have to reference to that document. It's a balanced one. Now, there are many other issues dealt with by G20 related to investment, such as investment impact on low and middle income countries assessment that was during the G20 Los Cabos, Mexico, and we try to set up a framework of indicators for assessing or evaluating the impact of investment on job creation and inclusive growth in low-income countries. And there was also Australian presidency dealing with PPP, infrastructure and the public-private partnership coming up with, and then the result was the establishment of G20 Infrastructure Center in Australia. And then later on, there was the Turkish presidency, Russian presidency, were dealing with GVC, global value chain, SMEs, and important thing that I forgot to mention was 2017 G20 presidency by German government. And at that time, that we helped to draft and facilitate negotiation of G20 package for investment facilitation. And that one was informally agreed that negotiation went into after midnight to 3 o'clock in the early morning, and there was no bracket of the text of the package agreed. But unfortunately, the whole package, particularly in the trade aspect relating to WTO futures, failed. Therefore, the decision of G20 was no outcomes on trade and investment for Germany. But that document in the future will be important. So that's kind of brief history. I would say that G20 has done a marvelous job. And for this year, that the important document under the Italian presidency was this non-binding policy toolkit for green and digital transformation of micro and small medium-sized enterprises and entrepreneurship that was drafted by UNCTAD in collaboration with World Bank, OECD, WTO, ITC, and it's now the presidency's outcome. And the last week when we were in Toronto, and the ministers had a statement on trade and investment, and this policy toolkit was referenced. So that winds up what it is. Regarding to the future on investment, I advise you to listen to the session which is going on just downstairs on the investment roundtable, the ministerial roundtable on investment. The forthcoming G20 presidency, the Minister of Trade, Lutfi, spoke a moment ago about his thinking about next year. I don't think he gives the full clarity, full range, because I think he just shed some light. We need to read between the words and listening to him. That's the rough idea. Thank you for this brief history. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Mr. Zhang. Thank you. Thanks a lot. So over the next 50 minutes or so, our speaker will answer our question and offer you a deeper understanding of the contribution and knowledge built by the T20 during the Italian presidency of the G20, and how this contribution can shape now the G20 agenda across the 3 pillars: people, prosperity, and planet, highlighting perhaps the role that the investment, both public and private, can play to address these challenges. But I need to give you some practical information. So, as you know, we will have time from some Q&A at the end of the session. Please write them down on the box that you see on the screen. And then at the end of the work of the panelists, Haile Palan will post them to our panelists. And second information, as a backup solution, if anything goes wrong with the streaming, you have a Zoom link that you can use to follow the panel. So let's start. First of all, let me introduce our panelists. We have Professor Alejandra Cardini, Director of the Education Program Center for the Implementation of Public Policies for Equity and Growth. And we have Mr. Luis de Mello, Director, Economics Department, OECD. Professor Bernard Höckman, Director of Global Economics of the European University Institute, and then Professor Carlo Secchi, who is the Vice President of ISPI. So Professor Secchi, my first question will be for you. We know that the term of the Italian presidency approaches to an end. The summit of the head of state and government will be at the end of next week, 30 and 31st of October in Rome. We know that T20 has been like a vital ideas bank to inspire policy discussion of the G20 leaders. So what can you tell us? What have been the main contribution of the T20 feeding into the G20 agenda? And what outcomes should we realistically expect from the forthcoming summit, Professor?
Okay, thank you very much, Liliana, for your question, and many thanks to UNCTAD for having organized this panel discussion. I'm very pleased to take part of it as Vice President of ISPI, which is the national coordinator and chair of the Think 20 subset. And I'm also the co-chair of the T20 Task Force 7 on infrastructure investment and financing. So perhaps I have a few interesting elements for our audience to report. We have done a lot of work this year, and notwithstanding the fact that the last couple of years have been very difficult for the global community. You know all of the reasons, and in such a difficult context, both the Italian G20 and the T20 took place and are completing their task, playing the role of the ideas bank of the G20. This is what the T20 is doing, something not easy to do, especially in today's international framework. Still, we have tried hard to offer a meaningful contribution to the G20 in terms of clear and sensible policy recommendations. The results look quite remarkable in our opinion. Despite the travel restrictions, the T20 engaged with over 600 researchers and academics from more than 50 countries who produced 125 policy briefs. Moreover, after the Inception Conference in February, we organized 18 roundtables with around 700 experts and discussants. And on top of this, 3 high-level forums, 1 global policy forum, and 2 T20 associated events. And last week, a few days, 2 weeks from now, we held at Bocconi University in Milano the T20 Concluding Summit from 4 to 6 October, held in a hybrid format with more than 50 distinguished speakers from all over the world. As I said, the 10 thematic task forces have produced many policy briefs, and the final communique handed over to Minister Daniele Franco, Minister of the Economy and Finance, at the end of the T20 summit. Now let me touch quickly, given the little time available, on some of the key recommendations on the 3 catchwords adopted by the Italian G20 agenda: people, planet, and prosperity. On people, of course, the focus was on global health as the most urgent priority, advocating the establishment of a global health equity observatory to tackle better problems related to poverty and unemployment, including, if possible, the introduction of a global citizen's income. We also focused on enhancing job opportunities for disadvantaged groups, to regulate better remote working, and of course, the basic role played by education. On planet, the G20 should make, according to us, a renewed commitment to deploying budgetary instruments to encourage decarbonizations. Emerging countries should be provided with the appropriate funds to face the transition. And so we propose to set up a common international taxonomy to facilitate green investment. We propose to establish a commission to offer capacity building for workers. And of course, a special role should be played by agriculture and receive all necessary attention. And finally, on prosperity, we advise to continue supporting economic recovery by keeping monetary and fiscal policies expansionary, by being wary of the risk of future financial crisis, and find ways to progressively deleverage debt stocks, given the high level reached. We propose to better coordinate tax policies, which is key to diffuse unfair competition, and we welcome the commitment to establish a global minimum tax on multinational corporations. On international trade, we pushed for a reform of the WTO, and finally, on digital transformation needs to be tackled so that everyone benefits from the related opportunity without being left behind. And in the final document, I'm sorry for having to be a bit faster in giving you these elements. Our interested audience can find all necessary details, and some will be picked up also by the other speakers. And to conclude, we were glad to see that many of our key proposals have turned into G20 initiatives, like the pledge, like the global minimum tax, the reaffirmation of the 100 billion annual pledge to support the poorer countries, the issuance of 650 billion special drawing rights, and others. There's still a lot to do. We are confident that the forthcoming summit in Rome, concluding the Italian G20 presidency, will be a good and well used occasion for G20 leaders to step up in their ambition in this very crucial time for the world economy and society. And obviously, we should not overestimate this G20 as an opportunity to solve all the issues on the table, because we are in a very complex situation with severe geopolitical tensions. However, the daunting challenges that we are facing and the international community give a sense of the urgency for the G20 leaders to act and find responses that can effectively work for our people, planet, and prosperity. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much. So you gave us the highlights of the conclusion, the main contribution of the T20. Now I would like to ask to our panelists to give us a little bit on but the particular pillars, what the T20 decided, what the T20 thought, and what are the key priorities for each pillars, and what is the role that public and private investment can play to achieve them. So first of all, Professor Cardini, may I ask you to give us a sense of what are what happened on people pillars.
Okay, thank you very much, Liliana, for the question, and thank you very much for the invitation. The G20 has always worked to envision and strengthen a comprehensive approach towards global challenges. And this has been named in different ways in each G20 and T20 presidency: recoupling societies in Germany, changes for the welfare of humankind in Argentina, and seeking sustainable, inclusive, and resilient societies in Japan and Saudi Arabia. I think that today Italy's presidency is reinforcing these efforts very effectively with the idea of these three pillars. And at the same time, these three pillars provide new insights in a very particular situation for the global context, a situation that nobody would have imagined that could be occurring. So in general terms, the T20 recommendations regarding policy are four and are very linked to this particular context. And I want to mention them because they are totally related to the recommendations regarding the people pillar. So the general T20 recommendations have identified in this particular context that there is a need to target simultaneously individual and social welfare. And to do that in this context, we need to focus on policies that aim for things that address emergency, and that we'll see in education how that is affected, to mitigate effects on the most vulnerable, to plan recovery. All policies need to focus on the recovery of something that was unexpected, and also reimagining a more inclusive future. So with those four ideas, I want now to focus on the pillar of people. And there we have two main dimensions of recommendations. The first one, the one that Carlo was mentioning with great detail, is global health. So I'm not going to focus there because Carlo explained exactly what the main recommendations are. And that is undoubtedly the most urgent and short-term priority. We need to manage to leave that COVID-19 health emergency entirely behind us to be able to move towards a social and economic recovery. The second one, and I want to take my 2 next minutes to focus on this, is more a long-term challenge and is related to inclusion and inequality. After almost 3 decades of continued global reduction, poverty has risen again, is rising again. And vulnerable groups such as women and youth have been in the worst situation, and this was aggravated in particular conflicts and areas like Afghanistan. So there are 3 key recommendations. The first one, to enhance labor markets and job opportunities, especially for disadvantaged groups. The second one, to strengthen cross-country policy coordination to provide basic income and in taxing multinational corporations. And the fourth, and I'm going to be giving more detail about this one because it's my area of expertise, is improving access to education. This is very important, and the T20 has acknowledged the crucial role of education, not only to recover the ground during the several lockdowns, school lockdowns, and achieve SDG 4 on equality of education, but also for a more broader picture leading to other SDGs such as ending poverty, reducing inequality, fostering gender equity, building economic growth, and even addressing climate change. So as I said, I will focus on this later, but let me celebrate here the main focus that education has had in this presidency. So investment and how to invest all this, and we're going to talk in more detail about specific education policies that we need to address. Well, that's a very complex issue that I think it needs a lot more discussion. And I think education sector is a sector where how private investment and how public and private investment should think and create mechanisms to achieve our targets is not really clear, and there are a lot of discussions that need more clarity, such as to give recommendations. We acknowledge, and the T20 acknowledge, that the states are the duty bearers of the right of education fulfillment, but surely the private sector actors engagement plays a central role, not only in providing financing resources, but also through civil society and partnerships between state and the private sector. So I think there are a lot of opportunities, a lot of experiences, but we still need to have a common idea of the risks and the opportunities of how to engage different forms of investment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Cardini. And as you said, we will talk a little bit more about education, which is really priority. Okay, number 2 after public health, but we hope that public health will be, the pandemic will be just a nightmare in the next couple of months. Second pillar, planet. So Mr. De Mayo, the floor is to you, remembering everyone that after the G20, just the day after G20, we will head to Glasgow, COP26, and we have a lot of work to do in both summits. Mr. De Mayo, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Liliana. Great pleasure to be with you all today, here with Carlo, Alejandra, Bernard, and thanks to James also for the invitation by UNCTAD, and congrats to UNCTAD and ISPI for this event. I've had the pleasure of being the lead co-chair of one of the task forces for the Italian T20, Task Force 2 on climate change, sustainable energy and environment. And some of the key messages that came out of the work of the T20, I think Carlo mentioned a few of them, really point in the direction that you mentioned, Liliana, about putting putting our economies and society on a better footing to face the challenges that we are facing now. Climate change is definitely the greatest long-term challenge of our time. It has been a key item in this year's G20 agenda, with Italy as co-chair of COP26 as well, together with the United Kingdom. There are 2 main points that I would like to make from the start. One is that at present, the goal to limit global warming to below 2 and preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius still seems out of reach. And the other point is that the international efforts to tackle climate change are still very uneven across countries. And this is the why. The T20 is making recommendations to the G20 countries around the key role they can play to promote a more coordinated efforts towards decarbonizing our economies and societies, while supporting the economic recovery from this pandemic. Several important messages can be highlighted in this regard that came out of the work of the T20. I would say that one of them is for the G20 countries to commit to becoming carbon neutral by 2050, and to define their long-term strategies, including targets for 2030 and 2040. We know that ambitious decarbonization will require government intervention, but also a lot of private support and investment as well, which is the key message, I think, of our discussion today. Another important message is to pursue energy efficiency while exploring alternative promising sources like hydrogen, for instance. Dealing with energy poverty is an important aspect of this objective, given the number of vulnerable households who cannot afford to pay their energy bills at the moment. There is also the issue related to ensuring food and water security. For that, it will be very important to build a resilience and to improve the sustainability of agri-food systems. Protecting marine biodiversity is another important component of the T20 messages in this regard. Recognizing nature-based solutions, in addition to all our traditional budgetary and non-budgetary instruments to fight and adapt to the climate change. Another important message that the T20 is aiming to get across. Tackling the interaction between migration and the environment, addressing environmental impacts on rural migration, for example, urbanization needs of different countries. All that will require both mitigation and adaptation actions. Let's not forget innovation. And hopefully with a renewed impetus for green technologies. It's an important element of decarbonization. A lot of the technological improvements that will be needed in this area can be supported through innovation programs. channeling public and private investment to innovative projects and providing economies with appropriate funds to do so will be an important element of achieving these goals. And Liliana, just to conclude this first round, let me make 2 more points here, which I consider important. One is to stress the importance of ensuring that the decarbonization transformation that will be needed for our economies and societies is just. It's important to deal with transition costs. The climate crisis affects regions, communities, social groups on different scales. Take the case, for instance, of workers that will be most adversely affected by the transition. They will need to be supported through appropriate social protection schemes, also education, as Alejandra mentioned, training programs that can equip them with the skills that they will need to thrive in a greener economy. Finally, another point that is important to make, that is about creating political momentum and setting the tone in view of the upcoming meeting of the COP26. This can be aligning and mobilizing capital to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement and the 2030 agenda. The decision to create a sustainable finance working group in the context of the G20 finance track, for example, is an important step in this direction, but we need to recognize that there is a long way and a lot that will need to be done in this area. So a lot of work ahead of us, but also very good opportunities that we'll need to seize in the context of a recovering global economy. All the work done by the T20 is precisely to provide advice to G20 members so that they can make the most of this recovery to facilitate a cost-effective and inclusive transition to a low-carbon economy. Investment is a crucial part of that. I hope to come back to that in the next round. But thank you for that, Liliana.
Absolutely, we will go back to that because it's a central point. Now let's address the third pillar, prosperity. So Professor Heckman, what can you tell us about what the T20 wrote down about prosperity?
Great, thanks, and a pleasure to be with you all. Let me make a few kind of introductory overarching points and then say a little bit about some of the more substantive dimensions that have come out of the various pieces of work. So first, I think it's really important, and maybe it's stating the obvious, but I don't think it gets internalized enough. I mean, these 3 Ps, they all hang together, right? We're not going to have prosperity without dealing with the agenda that has to do with people and with the planet. So that's one kind of overarching message that comes out of a lot of the work. Secondly, I want to emphasize that, as was mentioned by Professor Secchi, there are 125 pieces of recommendations that have come out of this exercise. So it is impossible to do justice to all of that. So I apologize in advance to missing particular elements. But I think if you look at the broad range of the various pieces of work and recommendations that have been made on the prosperity front, I think there's 2 things that I want to emphasize here. And one has to do with investments. And that investment is not just infrastructure, buildings, broadband, networks. There's a lot of soft infrastructure in which we need to invest. And that investment will have some financial dimensions, but largely it has to do with changing policies in terms of dealing with and creating the preconditions for greater prosperity down the road. So a few specific elements that I take away from all the work. One relates to the recovery from COVID. And I think here, one of the takeaways of what we have been observing here is there has been a huge amount of inequality in terms of dealing with this particular pandemic. One implication of that and one consequence of that has been a further erosion of trust that we already had in terms of international cooperation. And that is certainly the case if you talk to people in Africa and other parts of the developing world who are essentially arguing that, you know, we were kind of left hanging here, right? So there's an immense amount of inequality, both in terms of dealing with the disease, vaccines, but also in terms of the fiscal support that was available, the economic mechanisms that are available to governments to deal with that. So I think one key kind of dimension of recovering from COVID and building back better really has to deal with dealing with these inequities and inequalities in terms of putting in place mechanisms in the future so that it becomes that the response would be more balanced, but also that we build the capacity in all of the different parts of the world to actually deal with these shocks. I think another common theme that comes out of many of the recommendations and thinking has to do with structural transformation, right? And COVID, in a sense, has accelerated a process of structural transformation that was already ongoing in terms of economies, towards services, towards digital, towards new technologies. And of course, that had very positive effects in terms of helping us get through this pandemic. At the same time, it has also accelerated a process of change, which again has implications, different implications for different groups in societies and for different countries in the world. One of the takeaways and one of the messages that really gets stressed in a lot of the policy briefs that have been prepared is the importance of maintaining an open global trading environment, right? To ensure that the global value chains that at the end of the day have been supplying all of us with food, with consumer goods, with services, entertainment, and so forth, that those continue to be able to operate and that we make them more robust and resilient. And we can come back to how that might be done. There's a number of recommendations that come out of the various pieces of work on this, but a lot of them again have to do with re-emphasizing the importance of openness in terms of ensuring mobility of people, in terms of ensuring connectivity, so that firms can actually provide services to customers. A lot of that now is increasingly services digitally oriented, and that then gets us into the regulatory domain where there really is a need for international cooperation. So examples are regulation of data flows, privacy regulation, all of which fulfill and aim to achieve domestic regulatory objectives, but which nonetheless can impede trade and might actually gum up the operation of the value chains on which we are increasingly reliant. My final point on this relates to the private sector and cooperation with the public sector. And here I think there is one of the things we've learned from COVID, one of the things we've learned from the problems that confront global supply chains at the moment in terms of imbalances between supply and demand, and the logistics problems that have been experienced by many shippers, is we really need much stronger partnerships between the private sector and the public sector, both in terms of providing information as to how the world actually works, being able to identify where there are these constraints in value chains that can be addressed through policy and or through investments by firms, but that need to again be supported by a supportive policy environment. So I think the vaccine situation we saw early on this year is a good example of the need for much more information between public-private, but that goes more generally. And I think, again, to come back to the value chain example, which we might come back to in the second round, that also illustrates the need for a much better understanding of where are the fragilities, where is there a need for diversification, where is there a need to build in greater slack, and is there going to be an acceptance for the inevitable increases in prices that is going to generate, right? So in a sense, what we're saying, to be more robust, we need to become a bit less efficient. That has costs, and that does not have to come at the cost of prosperity, but it does have to be accepted by policymakers and by consumers. So that's going to be another challenge looking forward. Thanks.
Thanks to you, Professor Heckman. So before we go to the second round of questions, a couple of recommendations to the panelists. Please stick to the 5 minutes rule, otherwise we won't be able to have not even one question from our public. And then to our public, we hope to be able to have time to make 1 or 2 questions. Let's see what will happen. We do our best. So Professor Secchi, Professor Heckman just mentioned infrastructure. Not enough, but it's a key to an effective recovery. What is the latest thinking explored by the T20 on ways to mobilize and enhance public and private financing for investing in infrastructure, Professor?
Well, that is indeed, I agree. I think Professor Uckman was very right in his statement. One of the crucial points. I was in the co-chairing the task force dealing with infrastructure. Infrastructure includes a lot of sectors, from transport-related, energy, telecommunication, digital, and large. It includes very large projects, national, international, cross-border. It includes also smaller projects, but very important to improve the quality of life in cities and to turn them into smart agglomerations and not the way they are now. So it's a very complex set of activities where, in any case, a crucial role is played both for the recovery and in terms of employment, additional demand, etc., and in terms of setting the basis for long-term growth. So good to focus the attention on that. The problem, as normally it happens, is the lack of enough resources, and particularly in the last years, we have seen decreasing capacity by the public sector to invest in infrastructure. I'm thinking of before the pandemic. But at the same time, we are facing now an increasing interest by the private sector to be taken on board. To be taken on board through forms like the PPPs, public-private partnerships, revisited, renewed, adapted to the current situation. To be taken on board in other ways, to be part of a suitable and quite important mixed use of resources. We call blending public and private resources, and different instruments which allow blending, for example, of public grants and private loans, allow also to better mitigate the risk and allow to create a wider market. What is important in the field of PPPs, which raise a lot of expectations but sometimes produce little results, is to go in the direction of standardization of contracts, better role public-private like blending, forms which allow the market to widen, to become more liquid, and consequently to attract an increasing interest from investors. And parallel to the T20 exercise, a few days ago, also the last conference by the so-called D20 has taken place. That includes the long-term investors. The focus was especially on infrastructure financing. And what has come out is an increasing, a renewed, enhanced interest in putting money into these activities, into this investment, which goes parallel to an increasing role played by more private financial market kind of private investors. So we need to take, to exploit, to make a good use of this special circumstance. Let me just mention one final action which is very necessary, which is capacity building, more advisory role, in particular for emerging countries, because the crucial point is the quality of projects we have available, and that quality must be suited, must be bankable, so to say, suited for attracting the interest of private investors. So to conclude, I think that those who are interested in looking at the final document will find some, in my opinion, interesting points on which it is necessary to continue working. And I'm confident that also next year, the forthcoming Indonesian presidency will take up them and further progress in this field. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. So now we move from the infrastructure for the, how can we say, from the economy to the infrastructure for the people. So Professor Cardini, you were talking about the education. We go back to education, and we know that no other investment has a greater return than investment in education. But still, maybe I'm wrong, but still, we don't see enough money put in education, not even in the first world, as we can call it. So can I ask you, what are the key challenges? We know, but the most relevant policy direction that the T20 has found to overcome the challenges? And also, do you think the head of state and government will listen to you this time? Thank you.
Thank you, Liliana, very much for the question. Well, yes, there is a lot to be done, and there was a lot to be done before the pandemic, and we didn't have enough funding, and now there is a lot more to be done. So basically, first, let me celebrate something in this crisis, and that is that this is the 4th consecutive year in which education is in the G20 and T20 discussion. That is very important. It was not there before. This started in the Argentine presidency in 2018, and from then on, we have moved in a network of 50 think tanks that have a focus on trying to link research, knowledge, and policy. And I think that's very, very important in this specific policy sector. So there are around 26 policy briefs. You can find them in the T20 website, and 3 of them were produced in the Social Cohesion and the Future of Welfare Systems task force, in which I am a member. So as Bernard said, I'm very sorry about all the things that I will not be able to focus in my 3 minutes, but basically I won't focus on the challenge because we know what the challenge was. We have all seen it, but I do want to focus on that the challenge is not over. Today, there are more or less 7.5 students that still are affected by complete school closures. So we are a lot better than we were in April last year, where that was 92% of the global population, but that is still a challenge. I also want to focus on another situation, and is the inequality between regions and countries to overcome this challenge, and in the way they were affected by the educational crisis. And they're just a brief example of this with my region, Latin America. Between March 2020 and February 2021, Latin American children lost in average 168 days of school. In other regions as Western Europe, this was only 50 days. So these differences are huge, and they have very different effects on the immediate consequences and the long-term consequences. So our task force focuses on 3 directions. The first policy brief looks at inequalities. It shows that they compound in those areas or zones that have emergencies and conflicts, and also more poor regions of the world, and also on those ones facing hardcore exclusion due to intersecting factors as race, gender, language, or disability. So there, the general focus of education policy should be education financing. I hope we find a way to find the mechanisms to do that. It's not only listening or not listening, it's finding concrete mechanisms to finance education, to focus on emergency digital distant learnings and education management and information systems, and also citizen engagement. Second, we need to focus on the learning losses and mitigate them. This is another issue, and we need to work hard on this, because this evidence is showing how these learning losses are disproportionately affecting children from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, marginalized groups, and less educated homes. So this needs to be the next focus. There is a policy brief on this. Main recommendations: to work on cost and time-effective pedagogical practices, to do curriculum adaptations, and to work on teacher training. And the third policy brief looks at early childhood. This is something that appears a lot in the T20 communique. It's very important to invest in education from the early childhood, and it also looks at the need of data. So basically, and to close, I think G20 countries have a very big challenge in terms of their own education systems, but also on how they respond and they shape and help in terms of regional and global impacts of the crisis. And I think that more than listen or not listen, we need to work on having clear mechanisms to be able to fund education and be sure that education is going to be funded. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Thanks a lot for your work. From people to planet, we talk about infrastructure, we talk about education. We need to talk even about green investment. They are a priority. The priority is to balance growth and sustainability. So, Mr. De Mello, what is the position of the T20, and what are the differences that you see between developed and developing countries?
Very important point, Liliana, here. Let me, in the interest of time, let me focus on really the headline messages here. I think the key point here is that the crisis is creating an opportunity for making this recovery from the pandemic compatible with the actions that are needed to meet the agreed environmental targets. So one first consideration here is that a lot of what has been said, by all of us actually here, requires investment, public and private, to support decarbonization. I'm only talking about the decarbonization aspect, which is a very important one. And those investment estimates are really large. Take, for example, the IPCC that in 2018 estimated that between $1.6 and $3.8 trillion would be needed every year to reach the Paris goals in terms of energy investments. UNEP also calculated a sum of about $4.1 trillion as the investment gap in financing nature-based solutions to reach the climate goals by, again, 2050. So these are numbers that set the target, if you want, of how much needs to be mobilized in terms of financing. And that brings me to the second point, which is that because these investment requirements are large, we need to mobilize both budgetary sources, but also private finance. Governments can help, no doubt about that. They can provide tax incentives and subsidies to encourage decarbonization. They can make also room in the budget by phasing out fossil fuel subsidies or any other public financial support for fossil fuels that will make room in the budget to spend on decarbonization. They can also use green taxes, for instance, rely on those tax revenues more actively than is the case right now. But it is essential to engage the private sector. Governments alone cannot finance all that is needed. But to make green investments viable, there is a need to set a common international taxonomy of sustainability. This is a key necessary condition for that. It's also important to have internationally accepted standards for consistent and comparable reporting of those investments and policies. And reporting is extremely important to underpin the disclosure of green investments, including green bonds and sustainable assets, for instance. Also important to pursue international efforts to adopt a clear definition of green bonds, for instance. This is important to promote the development of a well-functioning green bond market and to avoid having multiple standards that would apply to different countries. The international financial institutions, the multilateral development banks can also provide funds, and they can do much for the emerging market economies and the developing countries. And in those countries in particular, government sources tend to be more limited. Private funding is more scarce, given the ability of the capital markets in those contexts to mobilize domestic resources. This is a key difference that you alluded to, Liliana, between advanced and emerging market and developing countries when it comes to financing investment towards decarbonization. The G20 can play a very important role in coordinating all the actions of the international financial institutions and in financing the green transition in G20 and non-G20 countries alike. That's why I reiterate the point that I made before about the creation of the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group as a step towards facilitating this coordination, this dialogue within the G20 in ways that can strengthen the public-private link that is needed to fill this investment gap. And I would stop here, Liana. Thanks.
Thanks to you, Mr. De Mello. So my last question, then I will give the floor for one question from the public for Professor Heckman. After talking about infrastructure, education, green technology, green investment, international trade is on the front page headlines everywhere in those days. We saw after the crisis has no boundaries. We saw it every day. So what are the main challenges ahead for the system of international trade and investment? And what are the right policy direction to address them in your opinion?
Thank you. I realize time is very short, so I'll keep this to 1 minute. I'll make 3 points. One, directed to the G20, we really need to do a lot more to reestablish the case for openness. Right? There's been a lot of talk about reshoring, a lot of talk about strategic autonomy, and so forth. There's also been a lot of actions taken. That's, I think we need to kind of rethink. We built an open trade regime for a reason, and we need to kind of establish the arguments for that and why it's actually important for all 3 elements: people, planet, and prosperity. Second point, we need to start rethinking how we think about cooperation, international cooperation. That is not just negotiating trade agreements with all the complexities that are associated with that. There's a lot of scope and a real need for plurilateral cooperation, issue-specific cooperation, which is modular in nature, and where countries that are interested in a particular area can work together. So a lot of this revolves around international regulatory cooperation. Some of it can be done in the WTO, others can be done somewhere else, but I think we need to rethink how we consider maintaining an open trade regime as going beyond trade agreements and hard law and dispute settlement and the way we have done this to date. Third point, we really need to leverage the capacity that exists in international organizations to deal with the global agenda, to deal with global market failures, to deal with climate change, and in particular when it comes to trade, to provide much more information on what governments are doing and what the effects of that are. Right? There's been an explosion in the use of subsidies, fiscal support. Again, as I mentioned, huge inequality in terms of what countries are doing what. Documenting what is going on, identifying the effects of this on the playing field. So the competitive spillovers associated with these policies are very important. And in particular for low-income developing countries who are not capable of playing this game. And they are the ones who are going to be confronting the consequences of what has been done by the OECD economies. Very much understandably in fighting COVID, but a lot of these policy measures started after the financial crisis. This has been going on now for over a decade. And I think it really is time that we put the international organizations to work to say, okay, we need transparency. We need to mobilize Research Institute to analyze the effects so that we can actually identify what is a problem and what is not. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Professor Heckman. It would be interesting to ask you about the impact of openness in the job market and everything, but I cannot because I need to give floor to Haley Palan with one question from our public. Haley, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you. So we have one question here. It's directed towards Professor Heckman, and it is, what is your view on the issues global supply chains are currently experiencing all around the world? Can this further feed the backlash movement against globalization, and how to avoid that?
Should I just answer? I guess I have to, right? Okay, yes. So a very interesting question. And I think if you look at so right now we're reading every day in the newspapers, global supply chains are in trouble, right? So things are stuck in one port. Companies cannot get access to the supplies they need. We might be in trouble for Christmas. I also find that a bit ironic, given that, you know, we have, again, this huge inequality in the world in terms of access to really fundamental things like vaccines. But I think what it points to is a counter argument to all of those who argued before this crisis that global value chains were a bad thing, right? And that we needed, that this is something that it was a bad dimension of globalization. So you can't have it both ways, right? Either we want our value chains and we want them to work efficiently, or we don't want them. And I think what we're seeing currently is a little bit on the edges. What would happen if we don't have these value chains, right? And it is not a pretty picture. Me personally, I think a lot of this is transitional. It has to do with the adjustment and getting back to work post-COVID. But I think the lessons are very much associated with diversification of supply, like I mentioned earlier, building in some slack in terms of inventory, and at the end of the day, being willing to incur the costs of having a more robust and resilient system, which will mean some excess capacity in these value chains, which will be translating into higher prices, right? So I think how that will play out, we will see. But for me, the big takeaway of the last year and a half or so in the pandemic is supply chains worked a lot better than the critics thought they would. And yes, there are these frictions. They will need to be addressed through investments. But I think all in all, it's a pretty positive story. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you to UNCTAD and ISPI for organizing this forum and this panel. And thank you to everybody for being with us in this afternoon. And so we finish our time. The time is over. And well, have a nice evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.